Hello, YouTube. Welcome to Harris Football's edition number 2, or should I say episode 2. So today's topic is a little bit different from tactics and strategy, just a general concept that has been covered before in one of my economics classes. Obviously, I don't teach economics now, but economics in the past. And this is the issue of whether or not footballers are overpaid or not. So, when we look at this issue, we have to first examine the history. So, specifically, I'm going to focus on England here. Back in 1961, the average player made about £20 a week, or about £1,000 a year. To give you an idea about how much that is, it's just around 1.2, 1.3 times the average person. So, if you're a footballer, you're making good money, but not great money. And really, this continues on for decades and decades until it starts to slowly creep up in the 90s, but then really take off around the year 2000. To give you an idea of how important it is before and after the 2000s, if we examine even in other sports, for example, Michael Jordan, he only received about $2 to $4 million per season. That's really not that much when you compare it to LeBron James and other all-star players in the NBA today who receive $20-30 million a year. With, of course, the exception of, I think, his last 2 seasons with the Bulls, he made over $30 million. But the exception of that, most of his career was only $2 to $4 million, which is, in the soccer world today, roughly the same amount as Danilo, one of the right backs for Real Madrid, who's the 11th highest paid on his team, and is not even in the top 100 when it comes to salary worldwide. So what exactly happened? Well, we had globalization, which led towards ticket prices going much, much higher than they were in the past. For example, about 20 years ago, an average Premier League game, whether it's Arsenal, Liverpool, or Leeds, was only about £4, £5, £6 a game. Or sorry, I said average, I meant lower. Cheaper tickets about £4 or £5 a game, whereas today, cheap tickets are still a good £30 or £40. We also had this recently a very lucrative TV deal where the Premier League signed for a 5.3 billion, yes, billion, not million, deal, which earned each club over £200 million. So this globalization of the sport and this international market has increased club revenue, especially at the highest tier clubs, whether it be Bundesliga, La Liga, Serie A, or of course the Premier League. Another argument to be made is that, well, they were always underpaid, and in fact, they're just getting their take now. And some of the arguments include, well, first of all, footballers have short careers, right? Even though Cristiano or Messi or Neymar may be making a lot of money right now, they're not going to be making that money 10, 15 years down the line. Whereas a top-level lawyer, say who is 45 years old, is most likely going to still be making the same amount or even more when he or she is 55 years old. Another argument to be made is supply and demand economics. So a skill set footballers possess is very unique, right? The way or the level that Cristiano Ronaldo or Messi plays at can be done by only so many players in the entire world. This skill set, in a sense, is almost more unique or more difficult to find than a top-level doctor or a top-level lawyer. And finally, there's the argument that a lot of money has always been generated, especially from the 90s, and that it just never made the way to its players. It wasn't until the player unions started demanding more money that the money started making it to the players. I mean, for example, off the top of my head, we have Paul Lake, who once even captained for our city. He also played for England under 20s. I think overall he spent 5-6 years for Manchester City. Good 100+ games, and he barely made anything. This was back in the early 90s. So by the time he retired, he virtually had nothing left in savings. Garincha made a little bit more. For those who are not familiar with him, he is considered one of the top 10, 20 best players ever, and a lot of clubs underpaid him, and by the time he was retired, this was back, I believe, in the '60s, when by the time he retired, he had hardly any money left over. Further going along this line of, footballers should have always been paid anyways. We look at people at the top level. So if we look at top level CEOs, for example, for insurance companies, they're making 20, 30, 40 million a year. We look at CEOs for big companies, they're maybe even making more. For example, in an industry like music, Taylor Swift is obviously one of the top earners in the music industry. And even though she's making slightly less than Cristiano Ronaldo, Taylor Swift will still be around 10 years from now, 20 years from now, while Cristiano Ronaldo will not be making what he's making in 2016 and 2026. It's pretty doubtful. So where are we today? Well, the top earners are all making over £200,000 a week, which roughly translates to over $10 million. And we'll probably continue to see it rise. We also see a rise in player transfer fee as players bring in more money, as more lucrative deals are made with various sponsorships. You'll notice, especially in recent years, especially the last 3 years, we've seen big transfers. Most notably, Paul Pogba, almost £100 million. And we'll probably just see this trend continue, and we'll eventually see our first $200 million transfer within the decade, and our first $100 million earner probably also within the decade as well. I'm just going to throw my guess in there right now. I think it's going to be Martin Odegaard, an 18-year-old who plays for Real Madrid, a Norwegian player, and I think he'll be the first one to be that $100 million player. With all that said, we've been focusing quite a bit on the top tier. Let's not forget that it's an international game, right? There's tons of leagues all around the world in each continent, and when we look at these other leagues, for example, the Brazilian league, the MLS, the Allsvenskan or the Swedish league, the A League, otherwise known as the Australian league, all these leagues, when we look at the average salary, even the highest among these four, as you can probably guess, Brazil, the player makes 720,000 US dollars a year. So if a player can last for, let's say, 6 years in that league, a player can earn roughly $4 million. So that's quite a bit. But then once we drop down to the MLS or the Swedish league, the average player is making about $150,000 a year. So that means if a player, let's say, plays 5 years, a 25-year-old player up to age 30 makes $150,000 for those 5 years. That's $750,000 in earnings, which is not bad. But the problem is, once that player hits 30, there's really no guarantee what that player is going to be doing at age 31, age 35, age 40, or a player could get injured after a year, and then, what do they do? So even though these salaries, at first look, $150,000 seems like a lot of money, you have to remember they're footballers, right? There's no guarantee that they'll be making the same amount the next year. So making full circle back to our original question, are footballers today overpaid? My answer would be a quite definite no. They are paid quite adequately, and the top tier players do deserve these top tier salaries. What do you think?